Thank you so much for being here today. Over the last couple of days we had a very rich news feed in terms of agriculture and future changes and immediate evolutions. The carbon dioxide problem, we had obviously the remaining supply chain issues, possible price rise for both inputs and agricultural outputs, food prices, as well as the postponement of the implementation of the new future agricultural policy has been made as a political decisions. So after nearly 3 years of fieldwork in Wales, I think that now more than ever, I think Wales is coming at a fork, is at a junction, and we might be halfway through it, and there are already many consequences that we can witness on the actual fabric, on the Welsh farming fabric, as well as how it functions in rural areas. So I'll try to take you rapidly through the method I've been working with, as some of you have already been at some presentations I gave, and I'll then try to showcase you why this method is interesting by how this method is interesting by looking first at the landscape, at what we have at play, and how it influences how it impacts what we can get out of it. And I'll try as well to then to introduce you to the regional specialization of farming in small areas in link with the landscape, to follow on to what we witnessed over the last 30 years with really a local differentiation of farms with a gradual restrictions of possible evolutions. And finally, we touch base on what we're witnessing today and what could happen. So first, I'd just like to introduce the Agrarian Diagnosis by saying that agriculture is a complex object. It's very complex to understand what drives evolutions in farming you can see that there are many factors that plays into it, which makes it very difficult to understand what we're witnessing and to predict what's going to happen. The Agrarian Diagnosis is a bit specific in terms of trying to integrate this complexity by doing an in-depth analysis of small agricultural areas that you try to understand really well, that you try to connect to the wider context. To understand it really well, you try to connect the landscape that you have at play and what people can have access to, combine later with how it influences the history, the evolution of farms, and what kind of opportunities people have had access to get to how today's farm ecosystem function from a technical and economical point of view, all through interviews and fieldwork analysis and fieldwork. So in Wales we have a very different kind of areas. So you would think about the distinction between uplands and lowlands, but we have very different conditions due to the climate, but also the relief that in turn depends on as well the geology that we have. So we can obviously set out wide areas that look the same, that have kind of relatively similar climate and agroecological conditions for farming. So for example, I studied South Pembrokeshire, the Upper Dee Vale or the Vale of Clwyd, but when we start looking into it, it's even more precise than that. We have very important localism. So if we take the example of the Vale of Clwyd, so localism, so we have very different, we have a climate gradient, obviously like linked to the dominant rain winds coming from the west, but the northern wind being quite important and being cold and rather dry, which is very important for Wales, as well as a microclimate, again, when you get closer due to the relief from the east to the west, and it's obviously kind of important. We have a relief difference, which is linked to the geology. So basically we have a climb up to the east and to the west, but that gives after some different soils, and we end up having a very fine, a very micro scale kind of gradient in terms of actual potential. For example, if we look at the core of the vale, which is in red here, we can see to the right that at a micro scale we really have very different potentials. Basically, to the east it grows drier, and you end up with some slightly different types of soils, more free draining than what you will find at the bottom, and that would allow a wider range of crops to be done. So model agroecological units help us to understand this and to compare the potential. And this, in turn, directly impact the possible evolutions of farms on the landscape. So I was going to show you this about to compare the 3 study areas that I've gone through, but instead I went for some pictures. So the first one would be South Pembrokeshire, and so it's a rolling hill landscape. The smoothest of all. We have relatively low amount of steep ground in Pembrokeshire, and we don't have any rough grazing. We have a very relatively wet and warm climate for like Wales, with a gradient coming from the south to the east, which gave a dominant dairy industry due to the profile of grass growth that was particularly adapted, and the soil was particularly adapted to dairying, but it remains diversified, partly linked as well to the kind of soils that people can have access to, and with some very early soils, perfect for early potato growing. We have the Vale of Clwyd that stands in the middle. You'll see why. Basically, we have the large alluvial valley in the middle here. You can see it's relatively flat. We have a lot of ploughed fields. It's focused on dairying, and when we climb up on either side, we see that we have some hills that are very green, and the higher we go, and the rougher we will have, the rougher the conditions. But overall, the Vale of Clwyd is drier and slightly colder than Pembrokeshire, which gives a very different grass growth profile. Not as good as what Pembrokeshire was for grass growing, but it allows different kind of crops to be grown. Importantly, we also have some mountain and rough grazing on farms, either on the mountain of the Clwyd Range or to the west side. We have some kind of the top of the hills that can be relatively rough and reclaimed, quite steep. So, and finally, you have Bala area, which was an upland, but upland for like not a mix between a lowland upland like what we've seen in the Vale of Clwyd, but really a semi-mountainous area. Relatively colder, wetter, and the rougher you go, the higher you go, the rougher it gets. You climb up from the lush alluvial valley to which can be not far from a lowland in terms of actual potential, to the hills that will be a bit more yellowish with a lower potential, to the mountain. And higher you go, the shorter the growing season gets, and the lower is your production potential and your gradient of meatiness, did I say, in terms of amount of finished animal that you can get to the hectare. So I hope it helped you to kind of see the differences between these 3 different areas, and I'll try to show you now how it impacted the possible evolution in certain type in the history, and how it can impact things today. Before we start going into it, I'd just like to go back on the fact that a farming system, everything matters in it. A lot of things are put into action, and you cannot take one another in isolation. So even if I tend to do it today, usually it's, you have to see it as a system. So you have to take into account the landscape, the inputs, the outputs, and all the parts of your system to get to it, including the work factors, etc. Everything works together towards the same goal, the output. So I just wanted to introduce the regional specialisation that we witnessed in Wales. So Wales overall is specialised on livestock, but we have different types of livestock depending on where we're sitting. For example, here we are in Bala area, and we are an upland mountainous area. We witnessed a specialisation from mixed farm into relatively homogeneous beef and sheep farming. And beef and sheep farming storms mostly because we do not have the potential, after turning a lot of mountain land into improved other kind of grasses, turn rough grazing into grassland. We do not have the potential and the grass growing season and the amount of fodder to finish the cattle. This has been linked as well to the 20th century agricultural revolution, that kind of condition specialized the tool to each production system. Again, this was done in a very supportive market context. So an increase in output with a specialization happening over 50 years roughly. On the lowland we have a different kind of picture. This is for South Pembrokeshire. It doesn't look that good, I'm sorry about that. So we had a specialization on dairy production. As I mentioned to you, the grass growth profile is partly good for a specialization on dairying based on grass. So we went from mixed semi-autonomous self-sufficient farms to more specialized dairy farming with a relatively simple management and a relatively homogeneous management of the landscape all over the study area in dairying. In the Vale of Clwyd, we had a similar specialization on the hills and the core of the valley, although slightly later. This was linked partly to the fact that the Vale of Clwyd had a better, not as good a grass growing profile, definitely. Secondly, that the Vale of Clwyd had also access to highly remunerative market for its mixed farming outputs. So it's only with the implementation of the increased output with the 20th century agricultural revolution that people really went into specializing, because the tools were designed for one production. So if we start looking, so now I've painted you a picture to what we went into regional specialization, into relatively homogeneous areas in terms of evolution. Sorry, I forgot to say something about the Vale of Clwyd. Due to the fact that we have mountain land as well, the specialization is not as complete as one would expect, with the fact that a number of producers have not fully specialized into dairying and have kept some sheep to use the rough grazing that they have access to, or went into beef and sheep due to the kind of land that they had access to and the important amount of mountain land. So from the 1990s, farms faced an ever-changing context that was changing from year to year, and in farming we plan in the long term, and it was very challenging, a very competitive context with output prices and input prices varying a lot and infrastructure prices increasing. So if I was summarizing it, this is from a paper that we did for the IES presentation, we have two different contexts after 1990s in terms of broad context, in terms of subsidy, market access, etc. But the important thing to remember is that we had two big strategies to cope with that. A number of people, a number of farms needing an income, were in need of to maintain their income, or have a higher income, most notably when there were numerous family members, etc. And pursued an expansion, sometimes an all-out expansion, either in beef and sheep or on milk, in every kind of landscape, except those that couldn't do it because they were physically reaching the limits of their work productivity. And on the other side, we had other farms that were not as pressured or couldn't increase the limit of their farming system. They couldn't expand their farming system. It meant no size increase or drastic change, might have meant other evolutions were sought at to deal with it and to even maintain an income. They might not have been, for the two sides, we notice as well different impact in terms of land use intensity, which are very important. So I'm going to try to show you some elements of this climb up or climb down, and the different parts that I can see are kind of important in today's landscape in Wales. So the first one, I think, is like how do we explain the appearance of 500 plus dairy cow units in Wales? And obviously they are recognized as factory kind of farms by many, but we have to understand where they come from. And they expanded along the 1990s until 2000 in a very competitive context with high investment costs. And they were expanding relatively rapidly. They might have had a numerous family workforce to pay for. The problem is they faced also a difficult context with continuous crash between the output prices that they were selling and the input prices that they needed for the system. As well, the system that was functioning, of farming system, was going for more output, was incentivizing more output along the 1990s and early 2000s. So these systems went for it, but it had a cost because they were expanding really rapidly, meaning they had to take more land, investing a lot. So they got into a high output, high input model, which has some consequences. The first one is, as you expand brutally, kind of very rapidly, it begins to be difficult to find land. So you depend more on inputs to feed your animal, and you try as well to increase the output of the land, which is all the more necessary given that you are getting some land from all over the place at sometimes very precarious, under very precarious terms, and that can be very expensive and that you have to pay for. So there's a high output out of the land which might be necessary, and the work productivity, physical work productivity, is the main way to deal and to cope with the pressure under which they were put. On the Vale of Clwyd, this was slightly delayed. It's only now that we're witnessing farms that go past the 500. In Pembrokeshire, it was way higher already. We have to think that the Vale of Clwyd is more constrained in terms of land availability, and farms often started smaller in terms of size compared to Pembrokeshire. In Bala, even if there's no big dairy units like this, we witness these kind of things on beef and sheep, and the ones that followed a very large expansion strategy. But on beef and sheep, people that followed this strategy faced an easier context and didn't feel the strain to increase as much after the end of coupled subsidies. That's meaning that the numbers of food farms on beef and sheep have not necessarily risen since 2010. They might have increased their amount of land, but not necessarily their amount of cattle. So continuing on the high output system, I think it's very important as well for you to understand that when you climb up in terms of output, sometimes you get trapped. First, because trapped is a strong word, I know. Sometimes when you increase your outputs, you have to think about the cows that are getting a higher and higher yield, higher spec milk, that will end up with a very high quality of milk, a lot of milk, and it's very demanding for their body. So their body is focused around this output, and they are definitely not that good for grazing. They have a poor walking, and as well they need a top food. You do not give to your Formula One the same fuel that you will give to your car. It's a similar thing for the cows, and you have to be very careful about the transitions between fuel types. So basically, when you take them in or take them out, and this system is still managing dairy cows that go outside, that graze, but they graze, yes, they go outside, yes, but a lot of their food is still coming from what they get inside, what they get when they come back in for grazing. A lot of their food is not necessarily grass, because you wouldn't be able to reach this output. Again, the land availability can be a big problem as well and constrain this system, because you have to have a big enough grazing platform to be able to depend a lot more on, to use a lot more grazing. You have to have your neighbors that give up their land, or you have to have a big enough room for all your cows, which is not necessarily compatible with what you're doing. Right, so not everything is going as much as this way. Some people manage to increase depending more on grazing, etc. And most dairy cows still graze, but the average herd has increased a lot, and the yields have increased a lot as well. And the interesting thing is we witness similar kind of trends on beef and sheep herd, all the more the ones that are on production, focused on finishing. Right. So we talk a lot about the beef and sheep, but why would people go into a production which is not necessarily remunerative? Well, we have to think that before the 1990s, beef and sheep was relatively remunerative under the production, the farming support. And now it's only since the 1990s that farmers are price takers rather than price makers. And they're producing something which is seen as a commodity, something that you can change, interchangeable. The ones that can escape this are the ones producing that are on a big scale, that have a preferred relationship with retailers, or the finished one. They have a low added value. That means that they don't have a big economic creation, and this can get even lower as you climb up, as you get in rougher conditions. But on the rougher conditions, you will not be able to do anything else than beef and sheep. And we have to use the complementarity of the landscapes. For example, in the Vale of Clwyd, when you have some mountain land that you have to use, you have some grazing rights. And also, food systems are interesting because they are low cost, or usually, and don't require too much capital when you transition from one to another, which is particularly interesting for farmers. A low economic creation does not necessarily translate in lower income, as you can see over there, but it's very important to understand that subsidy played a big part in the expansion of beef and sheep farm, way more than they did for dairy farms. And today, the subsidies are very important for beef and sheep, particularly for farms that cannot increase the number of animals, that cannot scale up or reach the standards, the new standards from the market. So it's very important to have those. And the ones that are at risk are the mountain farms, as well as particularly the hill farms that are constrained in terms of land that they are accessible and that make relatively little money. Right. Is diversifying the solution to deal with it? I would just like to say that it's very difficult to diversify, and you have a lot of the opportunities are limited in terms of linked to where you are, when you do it, how you have access to capital. For example, a tenant farmer might have difficulties to get access to capital or to get the agreement of his landlord to start a poultry unit or a pig shed. And on the flip side, for the hydro, you need all the land control on the chute, from the top to the bottom. Otherwise, you might get into trouble. And you need also a national grid connection. And all of this differentiation have to fit in with the other side of the farming system, which often means that there's a scale down in terms of land use intensity. On the other side, we also have seen massive development in terms of increase in land use over the last couple of years over poultry, mostly because it's a way to increase farm without depending too much on the land, in terms of quality or quantity. The cost may be high, the cost in capital might be high, but it's remunerating and likely to remain so in the future, which is super interesting for farmers, even when you're looking at a long-term investment. Obviously, there are some impacts in terms of environment, in terms of increased land use intensity. Another trend we've seen, particularly in North Wales, is the development of dairy spring calving system, making the most of grass to milk the cows, matching the production cycle of the cows with the grass production cycle in the areas they're working on. They can make do of nearly every kind of landscape, so they're converting a lot of land of hill land previously used by beef and sheep system to those dairy spring calving. Something very important is they have special land needs because they need a high and relatively good and large grazing platforms accessible to graze the cows, because they depend so much on grazing, which is not accessible everywhere, and for which they are ready to pay a premium, but which they can pay because they make enough money to pay for it. And food systems are very important today because it's maybe the only easy route for new landless entrants into farming, and that is remunerating enough. There are middle roads, including organic farming, where you're going out of the commodity market, but again, you have to get some land, probably sometimes, for example, in dairying, the best quality land accessible in the area to go into high energy crop. You have to have a very good functioning of your farming system adapted to the land, which is difficult, and you need more land, which can be very difficult to find. In Bala, it might mean trebling your acreage. We're talking about people that are going down a bit in terms of land use intensity. A number of those are people renting out, and they've definitely been enablers, because I've told you about people taking in land, but there are also people giving out land gradually. But the subsidy system and the taxation regime have favoured people staying on the land and not releasing their land on the market. Most of all, and we have two different strategies here. People that will look for highest bidders and others that will look for other set of objectives. Those are definitely not the same people, but not the same thinking, but they might be relatively similar farms, which is very interesting to understand. and it depends a lot on the need for an income.
Today, farms are facing a new wave of uncertainty, very wide, and it really leads to day-to-day farming. Farmers making decisions that are based mostly on the market, what they can rely on, compared to the changing context in terms of subsidy or regulation that is seen as dangerous to deal with or tricky to deal with. But it's possible because we are in a relatively stable and profitable actual market cycle, even with the inputs cost rising quite fast. But small farms, particularly the tenanted one, particularly on low added value productions, and that do not have protected land or registered land, might be the one that would be in trouble in the years to come before we establish a new scheme and before everything is set up, because they're the most fragile and the most dependent on the BPS payments. So we clearly need to make sure that we do not forget this relatively high number of farms. On the flip side, we also have a hunger for land. Many farms type are expanding on more land to cater for regulation needs or development of their production to match the reduction in BPS funding by an increased work productivity and output from the farm. This kind of vision, might compensate the removal of the BPS on the land market. And overall, it will keep favoring incumbents and not favoring, and will not be a solution for new entrants into farming. Overall, we might be at the eve of a new selection between farms. That might be, for now, in the continuity of what we witnessed, climb up or climb down. It might have consequences on the environment, might lead to a higher input dependence, inputs that are imported into Wales and are not produced in Wales, might lead to a more pressured land market. Well, while we all realize that farmers were dealt very different ends depending on where they sit in Wales, in the landscape, etc., when they entered farming, the past context has really favoured incumbents. And it led also to farm selection and farm concentration in the farming sector. Scale being pursued as a way to maintain income in the farming sector, facing low-valued commodities, prices and market prices aligned on the world market. In this model, there is little room for new entrants, except on a relatively low number of production that do not necessarily fit within the goals of the White Actual paper from 2020 published by the Welsh government. There's a lot of current uncertainty that could lead to choices that will clash with the directions set out by this document. Finally, while I've been talking a lot about a two-sided actual sector, a two-sided land market, I think the SFS might fall short of its ambition due to the fact that the wider context needs to be understood and encompassed into the policy discussion to be sure that we do not miss anything and to be sure there is all the elements are taken into consideration. Thank you.